this second part of my interview with Dr. Jason Sexton, we get into more detail about historian Kevin Starr's vision of California. Kevin had very real opinions about California's place in history, but he was also open to dialogue with visions that competed with and even contradicted his own. And despite his place as the preeminent historian of California in his time, he was open to modifying or even changing his views. In our conversation, Jason talks about some of the people Kevin debated with and even became friends with, as well as the historians who came before Kevin and who influenced him. And if you pay attention, Arnold Schwarzenegger also comes up in the conversation. We also talk about what Jason considers to be Kevin's most controversial book and what contemporary authors he recommends, as well as what advice Kevin might give us today in order to try to overcome the fragmentation that Kevin pointed out. Again, I hope and I'm pretty confident that you're going to enjoy this second half of my interview with Dr. Jason S. Sexton. Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basic. So what do you think he was aiming at, and where do you think what would you think if he had to sum up California or the California experience or experiences? What was he trying to tell us? Is that too much?
No. I think that's right. It was a synthesis. He believed in the socio-political entity as, and in that sense was a true statesman. I'm not sure what he would think about borders. I mean, gosh, we'd all just love more time with Kevin. Mm-hmm. Because if you ask him the question of borders, I'm sure he did. This is a part of, there are bits of Kevin that I'm not fully, it was Prop 187. He was in favor of and writing in favor of when that came along. And I think that was horrible. And I think, but Kevin also was the person to first one to, if he knew he was wrong, would come to say it.
And he was very insistent on California's ties to both Mexico, Latin America.
Yeah, that's right.
Its intrinsic relationship.
Oh, yeah.
And the Pacific, like you mentioned, to the Far East, to Japan.
Well, he says that.
Philippines.
He says that in his first chapter, because he's got the posthumous chapter. How do you study California through this, borrowing from St. Paul, through a lens darkly? And he says it's in the fragments of the particularity. Trust your experience. And he says, and yes, California as an Asian place, not a place with Asians, not merely, as if you can compare, but on the Pacific and connected to the world. So I think Kevin, you're right. It was a synthetic vision, even though that's difficult to do and increasingly difficult to do. And I think he realized the increasing difficulty of it by his own effort at the end to go back to his own tradition.
Yeah, because he mentions this whole idea of fragments, of seeing California. You can only really see it in fragments.
Yeah.
But it's interesting too that you mentioned that toward the end, he goes back to Catholicism and tries to sort of use that as a lens to, or maybe more explicitly to use that as a lens to look at things.
Well, he doesn't. I mean, you don't get psychoanalytic Kevin. You get some of it. There's a volume he wrote, an introduction to a book on Yosemite, stories about Yosemite, and talked about his own growing up period. And Megan Kendrick picks this up in her chapter. But I've got to say that I was fortunate to get Kevin shortly before he died. He did an interview with me that we published in Boom, California, and where I asked him the question about the California dream and about early Californians. And I often teach my students this. I say, okay, trying to understand California, I start with Kevin. Because I asked him the question, what were the California values that early California, and this fits, I think, with your podcast, California Frontier Project. And because I explicitly did not ask about the values of contemporary California, but what values did the early Californians come with? And he's, and I guess some of it carries and persists, but that's a different conversation. And so he said, the values that the early Californians came with was the dream of a better life for ordinary people. And then he went on and said, and by that, he unpacked it in three senses. And it's life, right? The acknowledgement of life, the improvement of life, and the ability of ordinary people to achieve such improvement for themselves, right? So it was an anthropological, you might say anthropocentric vision, but for Kevin, it's never just that exclusively. And there's a chapter sort of on kind of Kevin's Christology in some ways, which you get in Land's End and popping around other places. But Kevin also did, as Mike Davis said, believed in the goodness of humanity. So you think, well, what kind of Catholic view is that? And Kevin would say it's a post-Augustinian Catholic view. So, but then he also talked about, the various threats that he saw, and especially the massive economic divide, that we have. This great fall off that, once when we believed in one another, wouldn't have been allowed. And yet but that also maybe also not reckoning quite fully with how natives were treated in California. Really genocide.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, you mentioned once again in the book, and like that this whole idea of redemption that's on the title of your book, right? Mm-hmm. Harkens to the idea of sin, and that for Kevin, if you want to call it the original sin or the foundational sin of California was the treatment of American Indians, especially following the gold rush, right? So, yeah, how does that sort of play into his overall vision?
Yeah, we wrestle with that in the book. And I've wrestled with it in my own thinking about Kevin's methodology. Obviously, telling a story, he's using narrative. I mean, he's not part of the critical historical school, but is trying to tell a story that he believes is true. And in some ways, precipitating, at least we argue, and on a panel recently, Manuel Pastor, I think, agreed, the connectivity with what you get in ethnic studies. And all the contributors agreed that that's often, sort of back to narrative. But narrative is an art form where, it's part of the humanities and arts and science in a sense. I mean, it's really bringing a lot of things together, which makes me think, I mean, how Hegelian is Kevin Starr with, of course, his dependence on Josiah Royce. Right?
Can you talk a little bit about Josiah Royce? Because Kevin obviously sees himself in this sort of line with certain, both in dialogue and in opposition and in inheritance with certain historians of California. Of course, we all think of Hubert Howe Bancroft, right? But it seems that Starr was both trying to correct the record with Bancroft, but he saw himself as in line with two historians in particular, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, who were Josiah Royce and Carey McWilliams, right? Can you talk a little bit about his connection with them and who they were, first of all, for people who may not know?
Yeah, I mean, Carey McWilliams, of course, the journalist of the left writing, California, and I think Kevin, political. I mean, there's interesting features that I think Peter Richardson and Mike Davis pull out in the chapter, connecting. And Mike mentions this exactly, how important McWilliams is for Kevin, especially for his engagement with Southern California. And maybe this led to Kevin's opening of some of the difficulties of California, when you get sort of the real strong lefty critiques of social structures that have been harmful. But then underneath that is Royce for Kevin, who's also a critic, right? Grows up in Northern California, born in the gold rush, Berkeley trained at a time when Berkeley was, good students didn't go to Berkeley, like they were in the East. And Royce, of course, gets a position, strange story. He's hired, I think he's hired like as an assistant to, he doesn't get a real full job initially, but William James hires him to, you got to come here. And so they end up, the pragmatist and the idealist, Royce, kind of sparring as colleagues, especially when they give back-to-back Gifford lectures. But, Kevin grabs onto Royce. And obviously Royce is writing about race early on and is writing about the gold rush and California's very existence as an American state as a moral problem because of what happened to natives. So Kevin is there, and he's reading everything.
But what time period is Royce writing about this?
Was it 1902? Yeah, early 20. Yeah, 1903. I think his Gifford lectures were 02, 03, something like that. After Reconstruction, before World War One, when Royce is writing, and Kevin, that's the idealism, the notion of a dream, and he mentions in the introduction to his first volume, Americans in the California Dream. It's actually beautifully put. More beautifully than I can gloss it, where he says in that introduction, and I mean, some of the ways that Kevin, he's early, he's a young man, he's following sources he can sink his teeth into when there is no real field. Like, I mean, what is California studies when Kevin's writing in the late 60s and early 70s? It's not really even, Joan Didion's kind of still living it all. So Kevin comes into it and he says, from December 1972, the book's published in 73. Here he does it again. San Francisco and Eliot House, which is to say the dorm he lived in Harvard as a tutor. And he says, of course, I love this line. He says, the dream outran the reality, as it always does.
Wow.
Which is to say that, we can imagine, we have to, because we're alive, imagine better lives for us, for our families, for others, and yet reckoning with the reality, which is to say that it wasn't a utopian vision. Kevin was always sort of holding these, and here's where I think the tension of the sort of, maybe a kind of, and I would have liked to have talked to Kevin more about his own personal theology. That would have been fascinating. And perhaps we do have it rattling around in the resources and in letters, and more work to be done on kind of what he understood about big questions, not just who we are and where we're from and where we're going, but the divine and kind of what we're, how was he reading, really reading Catholic theology. He understood so much context. Arnold Schwarzenegger sent me a letter, this book's, and he endorsed the book, but also saying how, and he said how much he appreciated Kevin's. Read it right now. He said he spent his career breathing life into the history of California. He served California's state librarian emeritus while I was governor, and I nominated him to be inaugurated into the California State Hall of Fame. And then this is beautiful. He says, I'll never be able to thank him enough for our enlightening conversations about California history or his prescient advice. Kevin was always there to lend an ear or to provide historical context that helped guide my work in the governor's office. And talks about their connection to USC, where the Schwarzenegger Institute is now. But I think, Kevin, there was a sobriety about his vision, but also because that blends into the idealist dreamer spirit, which can often, when that takes over, right? It can, and I'm not saying Kevin was guilty of this. In a sense, I think we all are. And in a place like California, where we are dreamers and create things and critique hard, we can tend toward erasure by the ways we sort of can kind of dream over the reality when people are hurting, and yet I think for Kevin, and maybe that's even in Kevin's push for the dream. I do have a couple critiques of Kevin. One, I think that his vision of California maybe collided with church too much. So his ecclesiology and understanding of California are sometimes hard to distinguish. But also that, when I talked to David Hewlin about this, Kevin's redeeming of Jack Kerouac. You think, is that real? That Kerouac has the end of his life, it kind of comes back and now he's this saint. And yet, in a sense, Damien, for Kevin, maybe with some exceptions, I think he saw every Californian as a saint, as potentially a saint, all part of the same community, laboring together, dreaming together, experiencing life together. And you hear these stories from his students, like people like Julia Wick, who writes for the LA Times, or I didn't realize Brie Lascata, who ran the Marty Center at University of Chicago, Marty Center in Religion and Public Religion, and also USC Center for Religion and Civic Culture. Brie said, "Yeah, he was my professor, and the way he was able to inspire us, to believe in each other, to dream together." And to be who we are, and increasingly better versions of ourselves. Again.
Going back to Kerouac and Starr, seeing him or rehabilitating him as a sort of saint at the end. I met Philip Lamantia. Philip was one of the later Beats who was contemporary of Kerouac. He knew the whole group, and Philip, at the time when I knew him, was probably late 90s. I don't remember when he passed away. Late 90s, early 2000s, and he had become quite a devout Catholic, and was a regular at St. Peter and Paul's and at the Shrine of St. Francis, San Francisco.
Traveling.
And he had become, I said, he had become like a regular churchgoer, and sort of returned to the Catholicism of his youth. And so, there might have been something of that in how Starr saw Kerouac, and Kerouac himself, that sort of served as an anchor later in life after the flying back and forth across the country, experimenting with everything. And it's all San Francisco, of course, right? It's all back in that place. Which makes me wonder, we talked about Yosemite, and Yosemite was a really important place for Kevin, and he saw it as sort of this icon of would you call it untouched California, if you will.
Well, he also drew from the early naturalists a lot, including John Muir, but others who talked about, I can't remember, like the need to sort of reflect the natural landscape and build up cathedrals of the soul. And of course, we have was that Thomas Starr King? One of these, I can't remember. Because you blend in the preachers with the naturalists, right? That are all engaging the place and its magnificence. And Kevin picks up a lot of that, I think, really trying to carry that into our present.
Right. And then there's also California as a Mediterranean on the other, and do you see a connection or it's a dichotomy at the same time, right?
Well, certainly, right. A global place, but also a local, majestic, natural wonder. And he endorsed one of the books he endorsed, and he pointed me to when we were working on our book Theology in California. He said, "Well, have you read this book?" And he had just endorsed. Kevin endorsed 1,000 books, but he wasn't going to endorse it if he didn't like it. And he liked so much. There were some things he did, like he didn't like Charles Taylor. He thought this is unintelligible, even though Taylor's a Catholic, political philosopher and theorist. But the book he endorsed, it's by a Berkeley trained, well, in fact, he's a Persian scholar at Berkeley called Joseph Kittrey, in his book Mountain of Paradise, published by Peter Lang. So it's kind of pretty inaccessible cost wise. But Mountain of Paradise, of course, drawing from the an interpretation of the Persian term for the origin of Caliphia, right? The Caliph as a Persian term. And Joseph, who took his degree at Oxford, so comes from the, sort of transatlantic, ancient British university thing where I come from too. And Kevin loved Joseph. Yeah, it kind of reflects on California as a world civilization. And this is, and here's what Kevin says. He says, this brilliant essay, he calls the book an essay. So always works in progress, right? 200-page book. This brilliant essay, Kevin says, points to the future of California studies better than any comparable statement I have ever read. And so Joseph is trying to hold together. He's also an interpreter of California psychedelia and religion, but trying to hold together this as one of akin to the great civilizations of the world, and yet is also a particular place, right, with a particular history. Which is where you get those Yosemite nights under the stars and the pine trees and the rivers and the experiences of as Megan Kendrick unpacks, both her account of an engagement with Kevin's understanding of the natural and built environment. And Kevin did say that he wished he had engaged environment more. He did talk about the destruction, of course, in the Mother Lode with hydraulic drilling that really raped the land, and he wasn't happy about that. And yet also celebrated the things we've built, Golden Gate Bridge, as well as, these are connecting things, but as well as, the Watts Towers he loved, and, both sort of taken from pieces of car, but also sort of religious artifact. And he celebrated the secular as well as religious and all traditions. And if there was something Kevin didn't like, you could probably talk to him about it long enough or give him just the right resources that he might start to, even Charles Taylor, might have, we're publishing an essay in a book next year, 1700 years since Nicaea, on the question of Christology today. And there's a chapter on sort of sifting through a lot of things to get at Charles Taylor's Christology. And I suspect if we gave Kevin that chapter, he might see
it's funny. It seems
Charles Taylor a little differently. So
that for people, and I include myself in the people who are attached to California, both in terms of its history, its literary scene, etc. But I think that there's this basic attachment to the landscape of California that people seem to be, even people who leave California for whatever reason, seem to, it's part and parcel of everything about the state. And it's clear that for Kevin, that was key as well. This place that, the landscape of which is so particular and so overwhelming, and that includes also things like, the forces of nature, of water, of drought, of earthquake, and the extremes, exactly.
And the extremes of the shifts too, right? Drought, fire, flood. Mount Whitney down to the Salton Sea. I mean, the extremes of, right. Beautifully in the single volume.
You start to think of California as a utopia. All you have to do is just pay attention to nature, or pay attention to a little bit of its history, and you see that it's this place that's full of drama, full of chaos, and he seemed to
people.
It's like they're all interwoven,
and its social structures, its inventions, and all one thing that's there to be, I think, for Kevin at the end of the day, celebrated. So we can find some way. And to be part of he would talk about, and I don't really like the binaries here, but he would talk about, and maybe in Kevin's efforts, he's trying to hold them all together. You talk about California as an American problem and a solution. They're all, that's I suppose a sort of cute device to help him understand the place, but the place is constantly, at least multiple things, at once. I find him so inspiring, so willing to be corrected, so willing to revise, but also willing to learn. And I think in that sense, Kevin, coming back from the early challenges that his life saw. And he wasn't, it wasn't that he completely avoided the struggle, couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
And that's the situation with so many in academia today, for example. But then continue to find his way, continue to, he and Sheila, I mean, he had a partner for life, and to see himself as a public servant. So then he would, go try to figure out where could he be. And every time I saw him, he would always ask those questions, like, how you doing? How's your family? Are you making it? And that never, and Mike Davis mentions this in his chapter 2, that someone set up a debate with he and Kevin, and he thought, he was going to go in, and this son of elite genealogy, and Mike was going to take it to him, and realize when he got there that he just couldn't. He was so charming and so generous and so open to Mike's ideas. And Mike found what Kevin was saying to be so fascinating. And, the meeting of minds of different, and I think that's also, Kevin's fusionist vision, that we all, not only can we all work together in our particularities, but we all belong together and to each other. And that is an idealist vision that is pretty radical in the midst of right, the divisions nationally right now, the challenges globally, often fueled by religious rhetoric that is not really in I mean, I'm a religion scholar by training, right? But which is often not attuned to the grain of the traditions, right? It's religion being co-opted by other agendas, and I'm not just talking about here, but globally, Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, and whatever ideologies are in conflict. Kevin, I think, was always working to see people coming together, right, for the sake of our humanity, for the sake of democracy. And he believed in democracy passionately, believed in workers, and that was where, the good life could be found in the ordinary. But probably also what DJ Waldy would talk about.
I like that too.
The sacred ordinary. I think Kevin liked that idea from DJ very, very. And of course, also, Don here doesn't live far from me in Long Beach. He's in Lakewood, of course, but we get together from time to time. Don was one of Kevin's favorite writers and quintessential LA chronicler in the particular.
I like that.
And
I
a
think
Catholic.
That's attractive about Kevin Starr's work, is this idea that we all belong together, that especially in an age of fragmentation, a place that seems very fragmented, that is very fragmented, but that we're all meant to be in it, and that comes down to not necessarily figuring out a unified theory of whatever it may be of California, but it comes down to people who are willing to be in it together, who recognize each other as necessary, above and beyond and through ideological, political, whatever differences. I really, I think, as you say that, I'm thinking out loud, that's, I think, one of the things has attracted me to his work and makes me want to go back and really go deeper into it. What would you recommend as sort of a starting, but if you want to know more, you want to get more into Kevin's work, what would you recommend as the jump off point?
Well, I think we would recommend Kevin's contribution in our book, Redemptive Dreams, and Mike's and others, from ethnic studies, Robert Chow Romero, my colleague at UCLA, and Russell Jung at SF State, and Peter Richardson's beautiful chapter, Anthea Hartig, writing the foreword, obviously from the Smithsonian, Rick Kennedy's chapter on sin and Kevin, Pilgrimage and Hope, and then Sid Martinez and Thomas Reifer at University of San Diego, who are kind of reflecting on sort of the political, putting Kevin in conversation with figures like Walter Benjamin and as well as Octavia Butler, and kind of really grappling. And we did want to do with this volume, we wanted to put some of the best questions of the disciplines in conversation with Kevin's vision. And he wanted that so bad. But then, I think Kevin's work, there's these 2 volumes which really kind of show Kevin shining in his breadth and depth of grappling with details in early California. So Endangered Dreams is this book on the Great California and the Great Depression. So turning to Southern California, and then Embattled Dreams, California in War and Peace, which I think start to show troubled bits of California, but also where in the midst of real pressures, Californians are able to find ways to pull through. He's not uncritical of what you have going on and with development. I mean, he's very critical. Figures like David Starr Jordan and others at Stanford who are imagining. And I haven't looked back at what he said about Oppenheimer and others, but with the science that's developing here. In fact, I should dip back because, and here's the thing about Kevin is as soon as you look back into his books, he was saying things about these moments that brought not only sort of analytic skill to really kind of follow the details of what was happening, but then he's making moral judgments and sort of really trying to locate these things as overreaches of what California could be that are harmful. And so I think those are 2. And then of course, for somebody who's really chasing up, early Kevin, it's probably the book that is subject to the most critique. I don't know. Have you taught it?
No, I haven't.
I taught it in a history class. And you have?
No, I haven't.
I taught like the first half of the book in a class on California history and this rapid monstrous maturity, rapid monstrous growth, the world rushed in, Thomas Starr King, and then he picks up Josiah Royce. I mean, here's where all the figures come in, John Muir, and Kevin's, trying to find people to latch onto. But my students hated the book, hated it. And because it was, because the figures, right, that we're writing and had any, mostly, there's exceptions with obviously in Los Angeles, with women who in early California life but most of the figures Kevin's looking at are males and kind of, these. And so you get a sense that Kevin is, committed to the patriarchy and these kinds of, which I don't think is true, but that, at least that book helps to locate how Kevin is starting to imagine the place, even though it's got some warts and it's got, there's some flaws in it, but I think it shows Kevin's developmental logic on his, and we're all on our way, right? I mean, I'm not sure anybody's written a perfect book. We sort of do our best with what we've got, and I think he's an example of that.
I want everybody to go read Redemptive Dreams, Engaging Kevin Starr's California. It opened my eyes to a lot of things and made me want to go back and dig more into his writings. And anything else that you would recommend people check out?
Well, of course, Mike Davis, other figures, give a shout out always to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work, which I think, in many ways grapples much more radically with the fragments, but also with a critique over the entire structure. And Kevin had much appreciation and respect for Ruthie's work. There's also Malcolm Harris's recent book, Palo Alto, History of California Capitalism in the World, which gives a few nods to Kevin's work, but really Malcolm is in his own right, bringing his own kind of young, new lefty critique of California, Stanford, Berkeley, does in some ways a follow-up job to what Kevin was doing. It's up for the California LA Times Book Award in a couple weeks. And so we're excited. And that it's just a beautiful account of the place, the Panthers and so on, and kind of the left history. And I would say just taking cues from Kevin, read the news, right? Read our local papers, subscribe to them, the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Fresno Bee, Sacramento Bee, San Diego Tribune, and all the any of the papers, our local Long Beach paper here. Journalists are often, they are our eyes for democracy, accounting for the real that's around us that we often don't have time. And Kevin was an avid reader of the paper, citing the paper, affirming those journalists on the ground, and they're our team. who we really are in so many ways dependent on. And so I think Kevin is right and wise from his work to inspire us to be dependent on the journalistic reporting and, the Desert Sun as well. Give a shout out to all of our, I'm not sure what's up in San Luis Obispo in Northern California, but yeah, the commitment to reading locally and not just local journalism, but local stories. Susan Strait, Riverside, and others, are those who really can help us pull this together and who we're dependent on. And I love your phrase, Damien, who are necessary, right? Everyone here is necessary by virtue of being here. And I think that's also a tip from Kevin to be about the best ways we can help preserve what we have.
Thank you, Jason. This has been great.
Thank you, Damien. It's such an honor and privilege to be on here with you, and to look forward to hearing more of your podcast.
Appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.